This is Dr. Jerome Corsi, and today it's Thursday. It's October 19th, 2023. Thank you for joining us on TheTruthCentral.com. We're doing podcasts every weekday. Let's go immediately to the war in the Middle East. The questions are being asked, and there's a very interesting article here on Discern by Mercola in terms of the World War III beginning. And I found the analysis here pretty fascinating in that he's saying that this Joseph Mercola is saying that the global cabal behind this great reset really wants war to get into this new world order. Look at what war does. It destroys supply chains. It causes havoc in the energy sector, the food sector, the workforce. Creates more dependency on the government. Everybody's looking to the government to end the war or protect them. And in turn, this private interests in central banks are gaining in terms of the multinational corporations. But the collapse of the global economy is in the plans of the New World Order crowd, the World Economic Forum, etc., and it coincides with the plans of the neo-Marxists, the woke, who are trying to take over the country. That's one of the major themes of this new book, and I'm going to start publicizing it here. It's going to be out here very soon. It's finished. I have my copies of it, and it is the truth about the neo-Marxism, cultural Maoism, and anarchy. And I think this book is going to draw quite a bit of attention, because I really go into the ideological and the phenomenological, the world in which the left lives, which is, this left is totally different than the world most normal people live in. They don't believe there's objective reality. They believe they can create their reality. And the globalists are happy to have the woke destroy, because they think they have to destroy what exists today, including there's too many people, depopulation, in order to get where they want to get, which is to be in control with an oligarchy, namely themselves, multinational corporations and the oligarchs to control the world. So, if we could end the Ukraine war, that would go a long way to ending this, plan to continue to have, we had pandemic, we had war, now we're having war, and we will next have economic collapse. That's the sequence we're going into. So this Hamas attack only fuels the hatred that's been in the Middle East, and Iran is clearly behind it. We're now learning that this hospital that has been the big issue for the last 2 days, was supposedly hit by an Israeli missile or rocket, was not hit by an Israeli rocket, but it was a Palestinian militia, and it may not even have hit the hospital. It may just have hit the parking lot. Which I think stresses how difficult it is to get accurate news out of the Middle East. Maybe it's difficult these days to get accurate news anywhere. There's so much lying going on, but the propaganda of saying that a hospital was hit with an Israeli missile that killed 500 people and caused havoc, and now they couldn't get health care in the Gaza, became a humanitarian issue that gets raised in the United Nations and around the world. And it inflames the Palestinians and the Muslims in accord with them all through the Middle East, are now protesting in the streets all through the Middle East, U.S. consulates, Israeli consulates, etc. And we've got havoc growing, because the number of Hamas supporters in the United States has grown tremendously. Again, I'm seeing the ideological bent of the universities having an influence on a generation of Americans, maybe 2 generations, in which the traditional support for Israel that was around since the end of World War II is diminishing. And Hamas supporters are gaining in strength, and Islam is now spreading throughout the world, including occupying much of Europe because of the immigration. So we have right now Islam on the ascendancy, and the Jews in the Middle East are really a small minority. The military is extremely strong, but this great reset plan is going into a phase of this great world war with unending wars. There's no real end in sight to the Ukrainian war as long as we continue to pour billions of dollars into it. And the Biden administration seems to want to pour more billions of dollars into Ukraine. This Russian incursion is not going to be reversed. But you've got a whole group of these neoliberal war hawks that think we should push NATO right to the border of Russia, which is only going to issue for Russia a threat on an existential threat, because it will block NATO were to dominate Ukraine. Russia would be blocked from its southern access to the Atlantic Ocean, simply because they couldn't get through the Black Sea. Russia needs Crimea and they need Sevastopol, the port there in the Black Sea, in order to have access to the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So what is happening, this Marcola is saying, peace requires being able to see both sides of a conflict, and that is something mainstream media do not facilitate. For example, we've been repeatedly told that Russia's attack on Ukraine was unprovoked. Yet Russia's patience has been strained to the limit for over a decade. From the Russian perspective, it's fighting an existential threat. Meanwhile, evidence suggests that the basis for the United States defense of Ukraine is related to it being a valuable money laundering hub and potentially a secret biological weapons manufacturing ally. Now, that's pretty frightening information, pretty frightening thought. But when you wonder why Biden, whose corruption is obvious, I mean, the amount of reporting that has been done from Hunter Biden's laptop and the amount of money Biden has taken out of Ukraine, out of Russia, not Russia, but China, and oligarchs all around. It's similar to what the Clintons did with the Clinton Foundation. I wrote a book on that called Partners in Crime, and nobody cared. The IRS did not care. Well, when the IRS doesn't care with that obvious kind of foundation corruption, not, the Clintons probably made the most money out of the Clinton Foundation. All the causes they wanted to help really were not helped. They sent defective HIV/AIDS drugs to Africa. When we had the earthquake in Haiti, Haiti was still left in a desperate condition, although the Clintons were all over Haiti trying to raise money for themselves. And again, if someone on the right had done that, they would have been immediately pounced upon by the IRS. We can't have a political justice system, a political IRS system, where the American people just have no trust whatsoever in this government. And there's no reason to trust this government. So now Israel's fighting the existential threat as well. American leadership is doing nothing to further peace in the situation. Blame is laid on one side or the other, rather than viewing events within a historical context and coming to a resolution. Now, there's a very good video on Discern today, and my article links to it. I encourage people to watch it because it goes back through the history to 1948 of this conflict. And one of the things this video demonstrates is that the conflict has been endemic ever since the State of Israel was created in 1948 by the partitioning of Palestine. At the end of World War II, the United Nations had a proposal to make Palestine a state and to make Israel a state. Well, they had that vote and it was done, and the State of Israel was created. But that night, Egypt went to war against Israel, and the 1948 war started, which went on for quite a while. Now and the British were there. The British were, with a British mandate at the end of World War II, the British finally pulled out during that war, the 1948 war, but the British were entrenched in the leadership in the management, the governance of that whole Palestinian area, now Israel, from the 20s through 1948 into the 50s. The British are now out of control. Israel's in control, but the violence has never stopped. It's been war after war after war. This video shows all the peace efforts that have failed and why they failed. Why they've failed is because the radical Islamic elements, led by Iran, refuse to accept Israel's existence. They don't want the Jews in the Middle East. They don't want a Jewish state in Israel. And as long as that's the bedrock position, all the other negotiation is not going to do anything to fundamentally solve the problem, because that's an intractable problem. The only solution to that is that either the Jews are killed, or you can't get an acceptance of the state of Israel. You've got perpetual war, and there's no solution in Ukraine unless Ukraine's willing to accept Russia's, as a nation state, its desire to have access to the Atlantic through the Baltic, through the Black Sea. If these kinds of problems can't be resolved, then the perpetual war that we're entering into is only going to accelerate. And again, the destruction of the existing order to create a new order, that's what's going on. We are entering a new age. Now, what that new age is going to be is in the balance yet. We don't know. Certainly, the globalists want it to be their age of dominance and control, totalitarianism. And we're fighting to have that age be an age of freedom and human development, which is possible, but not if a group desires all the wealth for themselves. If they desire to be in control of everything, including your thoughts. These are the kinds of situations we're facing. Now, in the United Nations, the second story I'm reporting today, and just following what's going on in terms of surveying the news, kind of like aggregating the news, the UN resolution for Gaza ceasefire, the United States vetoed. Why? Because the resolution, typically coming out of the United Nations, deplored the attack from Hamas, but did not articulate Israel's right to defend itself as a nation state. Now, again, that's because the United Nations is dominated by third world interests, and by the Palestinians have an enormous influence, and they are determined to do everything they can to deny that Israel has a right to exist. Even President Obama talked about the Levant. Levant's an old term, and it means this very general, somewhat vague but general idea of the Middle East, the territory that Israel has. When you say Levant, you're presupposing that the state of Israel is not legitimate and doesn't exist, not in a truly legitimate sovereign capacity. The argument is that Israel stole the territory. Well, of course, now we go back 2,000 years when the Jews were Babylonian captivity, Egyptian captivity, and then finally with the Romans in 79 AD, the destruction of the Second Temple, the diaspora of Jews spread out around the world. And biblically, God said in the Bible the Jews would come back. Israel will be reestablished. What Harry Truman did in 1948 biblically was an important event. It's also an important event biblically when Donald Trump moved our embassy to Jerusalem. And these are, again, at risk. What the Bible says, once the state of Israel was recreated, it wasn't going to go away. Ezekiel 37:38 sounds like a nuclear war with either Gog and Magog, and which has been interpreted to be Russia or Russia and Iran against Israel. And the war ends with God's intervention, and Israel is preserved. Now, again, there's a lot of biblical discussion of what that means. But the point is, we are at this type of an end of days conflict. Chris, do you want to comment? I'm going to shift now into this economic crash, which is coming, because that'll be the next phase. Chris?
It's also becoming a propaganda war. That's what we're getting at this point too. It's terrible what's happening right now in the Israel and Hamas conflict here. War, it should be, but we're also watching protests around the world. You're having college students, now, of course, regretting signing petitions in signing a petition in Harvard about their support for Hamas after the rampage on Saturday the 7th. You have other anti-Israel protests going around by the, let's say, quote unquote, hip crowd of professors and students. Of course, I mean, I won't begrudge the Palestinians at this point because you discussed the history and their point of view. But we have people here who are just falling for everything that's coming out of Hamas's mouth. When where's anybody been the last 50 to 100 years? Propaganda out of any site is propaganda. Don't believe anything that comes out of any site until it was investigated. And still, you can't believe today's mainstream media. So take everything that comes out of this conflict with a grain of salt at this point. Yet the propaganda war is going to be a war of sucking money out of the West. And now we see that Joe Biden just filtered 100 or is filtering $100 million over to Gaza at this point.
Well, the whole point of this is that when these conflicts occur, you got taking sides, and so it's one group supports Hamas, one group supports Israel. Well, Hamas led the attack, which was horrific, so they're at fault. Or the peacemakers have got to get past taking sides. They have to get past to start envisioning solutions. Now, that's been attempted. The Oslo Accord was the two-state solution. We create a Palestine and we create an Israel. Well, again, that's been the solution since 1948, when the United Nations tried the same thing. But the problem is that if you can't accept that Israel is a nation, the two-state solution is not viable. And it's not fundamentally resolving the problem. This problem's got to be resolved at a level where we recognize that we're all human beings. We all have a right to survive and a right to live, and that has to be respected. But governments engineering wars, and there's an enormous amount of money to be made in war with all the munitions that are made. That's what Eisenhower warned us about, the military-industrial complex. And by the way, the Jim Jordan lost the second vote yesterday, and Steve Bannon is reporting that the Capitol Grill, which is a restaurant near the U.S. Capitol, and a steak restaurant, has been very popular with congressmen and senators. The lobbyists were in there making sure the GOP was not going to vote for Jim Jordan. The powers that be do not want justice or fairness, or they don't want laws enforced because there's too much money to be made by not following the rules, by corruption, by the policies that are set in Washington determine a lot of money. That's why the lobbyists are there. Is the policy pro-oil? Is it anti-oil? I mean, all these different issues that want to make money in a different area of commerce, or in some way or other in making money in business or foundations or whatever, all have an interest, and they're all in there trying to get things done their way. That's just human nature. But again, human beings are contentious and not by nature peaceful. It's fundamental in our existence, and this has been always the problem in human existence, which is defined more by war than it is by peace. Peace is actually a rarity in human history. Wars breaking out somewhere are almost the norm. And again, if we're going to get to another stage, we have to get beyond this. I'm not sure how it's going to happen, except it seems to be that a great catastrophe, a great crisis is building. Of course, I'm going to shift to the economics now. Any last thing quickly?
I would say that this segue is actually quite good because we're looking at a real problem, not only with a potential world war, but we're also looking at a real problem with a potential, or actually maybe currently happening, economic war. China and Russia are a huge part of this.
They are. And let's just take a look at the United States. A couple of stories really caught my attention today. One was that the U.S. debt is adding around $28.5 billion a day for 18 days in a row. Now, put a different way, the debt is increasing $1.2 billion per hour. and is likely to increase the total debt bill by around $1 trillion in 6 weeks' time. Now, I was saying this yesterday. The way we're printing money with this modern monetary theory, we're going to accelerate the rate at which the debt accumulates. So we hit $33 trillion in national debt, which is more than our GDP, gross domestic product. And we're rapidly on the way to $34 trillion in national debt at a much faster pace. If you'll remember, going back to George W. Bush, we had about 10 trillion. Going back to Ronald Reagan, it was minimal. And today it's up to 33, going to $34 trillion. This is a debt accumulation that is not sustainable, because as you pay the interest on the debt, we're now paying more than $1 trillion a year just in the interest. And we just print that money up to pay the interest, which is not backed by anything. Eventually, we undermine the dollar. People just don't believe the dollar is worth anything in its purchasing power. You want to measure this, go to the store and see what $100 buys, and you'll be shocked at how little it does. Bonds are also down 3 years in a row. Now, this is also accelerating. The 10-year Treasury bond is down 5% this year. It pays for its third consecutive annual decline, with data going back to 1928, which is the Great Depression. That's never happened before. The worst 3-year period for bonds prior to this was 1978 to 1980, when Jimmy Carter had the stagflation, a 3% loss for the 10-year bond. What's the 21-23 decline? 26%. Now, that's unprecedented. I mean, anybody who knows anything about finance means that the U.S. bonds declining means that there's no market for them. We're flooded with Treasury bonds, and banks are finding that the Treasury bonds they had at zero interest rates have to take a haircut, which means they have to be reduced in their value, because you can't sell them for par in a market where bonds are being issued at much higher interest rates.
More of a crew cut. Not just a regular haircut, a little off the top. Nope, crew cut nowadays.
I think that's probably about what's going to happen. I mean, it's really, this should be alarming. Now, secondly, what's being reported is that we are seeing that the demand for buying stocks and bonds is decreasing. So, it wasn't enough that we had climate change, which was trying to get us off hydrocarbon fuels. Then we had the pandemic, and then hyping up climate change. And now we've got war in the Middle East. We got war in Ukraine. We could have war in Taiwan. This is a formula for a global crash. And that's what I've been saying. And I'm going to urge people, get a copy of this free book. When I'm writing this free book, I want to explain the dynamics of what's going on. The dynamics of what's going on are right here. The global crash going to cause an historic gold rush. Okay, now you can get a free copy of this book. I published it with Dean Heskin. Dean is a good friend. He's the CEO of Swiss America. We also have a Swiss America podcast on the website about the people running away from the dollar, which is happening. You've got to educate yourself on this, because there's a few things you can do. By the way, you can get a free copy of this book. The book is How the Coming Global Crash Will Create a Historic Gold Rush. You can get a free copy by calling Swiss America, 1-800-519-6268. I'm going to repeat that, 1-800-519-6268. Call that number, Swiss America, and you get a free copy of the book. And what the book will explain to you is that the two things I think that are going to start skyrocketing in value are oil and gold, because this happens historically. There's a history of this. What I show in the back of the book, and I summarize it, was that gold was at $35 an ounce in 1971 when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. what happened next with Jimmy Carter, we had a war in the Middle East, Yom Kippur War in 1973, then the Arab oil embargo. They stopped getting oil to the United States. Gas lines went around the block for cars getting refilled, and the price of oil and gold skyrocketed. Gold hit $843 an ounce when Ronald Reagan was president after the stagflation of Jimmy Carter. Then that was a war in the Middle East and an energy crisis. Okay, today we got a war in the Middle East, we've got an energy crisis. The energy crisis is largely caused by this global warming nonsense. In 2008, 2009, the collapse of the subprime real estate market, which then collapsed the collateralized mortgage obligations, the bonds into which those mortgages were packaged. And that caused the derivatives, the bets on the interest rate and other things of very complicated, the derivatives collapsed. And we had a great recession. And gold went to $1,426 an ounce. Then the pandemic, gold hit an all-time high of $2,074.60 on March 8th, 2022. And gold again is rising. And we just check right now and see where gold's at. It was over $1,900 an ounce yesterday. And let's see where it is at today. Today it's at $1,966.40. Gold is edging towards $2,000 an ounce. Get some gold, certainly for your IRAs and your 401ks. The other thing being reported today is that there's no demand for stocks right now. The stock market demand is really tapering off. We're in an earnings reporting season. This is October, November, December, the fourth quarter. So third quarter earnings are being reported by companies today, and they're not meeting expectations. Companies are laying off workers. Commercial real estate is not downtown worth what it was even 5 years ago because the offices are largely vacant. People are not going to return back to work. And I think basically the 5-day work week is under challenge because just automatically people are saying, well, we won't work Fridays or we won't work Mondays. So if you try to go into New York City, certain days there's no traffic. Other days it's packed. It is not what it was before the pandemic. The demand for being in New York is diminished by the fact that people can work from home. And this is a fundamental change. It's a fundamental change that is going to impact the economic value of New York, because if New York doesn't have people in the office buildings are depreciating in value. What's going to happen next is that the New York City is going to start collecting less tax revenue. New York starts collecting less tax revenue. We're going to have another default. New York is going to be facing bankruptcy because it can't maintain its expenses. The city's infrastructure is already sagging. Even in New York, I'm seeing more homeless. The homeless were always taken out of New York. But today I'm seeing Penn Station, other places, the homeless are coming into the train stations. They're coming in anywhere that's warm and it's about to be winter. And some cities like, Los Angeles, the California, Los Angeles has a huge homeless problem. So does Portland, Oregon. West Coast, these cities are dominated by homelessness. And so you're going to find cities failing. All right, the last story I want to cover is this whole automaker. The automakers are up in arms because, in fact, a whole group representing General Motors, Toyota Motors, Volkswagen, and nearly all other major automakers, they met on Monday, and they criticized the Biden administration proposal to dramatically hike fuel efficiency requirements. So this is the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's corporate average fuel economy proposal, in which they're saying that the burning of fuel has to be more efficient, is going to raise the average price of vehicles by $3,000 by 2032. And so they don't want these requirements, these new requirements put in place. And they're pointing out that it will not save a lot of carbon dioxide. It's not going to be saving. It's going to just cost everybody more money. The American Automobile Policy Council fundamentally said that the National Traffic Safety Administration plus the Environmental Protection Agency's regulations, which will require electric vehicles, make no sense. Not in terms of how quickly we could shift. Electric vehicles are not going to replace hydrocarbon fuel internal combustion engines. You can use some of them to get around town, but people have to travel long distances, have to constantly be recharging these vehicles. They cost thousands of dollars to repair when they're in accidents. The batteries are heavy and expensive. It takes hydrocarbon fuels to produce them. At the same time, this is going on. You find on the other side that NAFTA is saying essentially that they're going to revamp and reevaluate whether or not what is the efficiency and replacement efficiency of cars that are made by electric vehicles. So they're essentially saying like 72% of readjustment of the rules. The EPA rules are going to be how much hydrocarbon fuels they save, probably going to be reduced by a dramatic amount because they're taking into consideration the hydrocarbon fuels required to produce the electricity. Now, once you do that, or take into account the hydrocarbon fuels needed to produce the rare earth minerals that go into the batteries, electric vehicles are not saving hydrocarbon fuels. We're still using them, perhaps more intensely. And again, that's not going to even achieve any of the goals from the climate change hysterics, which want net zero emissions. Because the world is going to stop using hydrocarbon fuels is nonsense. Because if we did, modern industrial society would collapse. And one of the major reasons we have this fiction about hydrocarbon fuels producing, global warming, which was concocted by Michael Mann in the hockey stick graph that he devised, saying that Earth's temperatures were stable and copacetic until the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning hydrocarbon fuels. Then, like the blade of a hockey stick, they shot up to high temperatures. The historical, geological time data do not validate that proposition. We had more carbon dioxide 600 million years ago, and we've had ice ages since then. Carbon dioxide follows global warming. It doesn't cause global warming. And again, it's a causation argument that with the data it has to be correlated correctly. And when it is, you'll see that global warming is not a function of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's a function of the intensity of how hot the sun is burning. It's a function of whether or not El Nino or La Nina is in the Pacific Ocean as a current. It's a function of whether our orbit around the Earth is more elliptical or less elliptical, according to the Milankovitch cycles. I demonstrated this in the book about the truth about energy, global warming, and climate change. And now what's happening is the auto industry is beginning to catch these agencies with ideological agendas that make no economic sense and will spell the end of the auto industry. The auto industry has put billions of dollars into getting ready to produce electric vehicles. Nobody's buying them. They're too expensive. They're going to get more expensive. The infrastructure is not there to support them. Some people like them when they get them. They behave differently. They accelerate quickly. They have a different feel to them. They're more electronically functioning. But again, that's more sophisticated. And when it breaks, it's going to cost more to fix. Internal combustion engines are simple. They're more complex today than they used to be, more sophisticated in their design and engineering, but they're understood, and the infrastructure is there to support them. If we go to these innovations that bureaucrats want to impose, we're going to destroy the economy. And again, I'm pointing out throughout this entire podcast that there are forces, powerful forces, that want to keep Ukraine open, the war going, because it is so good at laundering money. I pointed out, I caught HSBC doing money laundering, the bank, the huge bank, because they were laundering drug money. I had the evidence for that. I started publishing it at WorldNet Daily. I got contacted by the Department of Homeland Security and the Senate Permanent Investigating Committee. They did an investigation. HSBC paid a $1.9 billion fee. I did not register as a whistleblower. I thought that was more trouble than it was worth. Didn't want the headache. Published the stories. No one went to jail. You cannot run the drug cartels without a bank. What are you going to do? Drive semi trucks around full of $100 bills? You've got to get the money into the banking system. And so therefore, the Treasury, which monitors all electronic transfers of money, would know where it's coming from. But just like the Biden family is not gone after, the Clinton crime family is not gone after, crime pays. And the federal government knows it pays. It gets a lot of money off the books. So the CIA has been in the drug trade since the OSS was working with Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Nationalist Army in the beginning of World War II. Since through the 60s and 70s, the CIA was in Laos and Thailand and Vietnam. And they established a heroin trade that was going through Afghanistan into the Middle East, and also other drugs, marijuana and other drugs moving internationally. And the CIA was monitoring and involved in it. And the drug cartels are a product of the fact that our intelligence agencies are guilty in this. And they do it because they want excess cash so that they can run clandestine operations, including operations against U.S. citizens. The Church Committee proved that in the 1970s. And with this much massive corruption, the solutions are not going to be easy. Chris, any final comments? I want to wrap this up so we don't go over time.
Oh, I guess the day is not going to come where we're going to be carrying around car chargers with us like we carry around phone chargers. That's probably what they're going to say. The funny thing about these cars, this whole thing about the electric vehicles, is they sound nice, and if you're traveling very short distances, and you don't really use the car that much in, let's say, a 15-minute city, then you're not going to need to go worry about where the next charging station is somewhere in upstate New York or in Wyoming or somewhere else like that. Perhaps that's part of the issue too. Maybe they want to lock people up. Again, we know they want to lock people up in 15-minute cities, but the electric vehicles may be another conduit for that sort of thing.
Well,
the transition would be another conduit for that sort of thing.
What you're pointing out is we do not want to live in the world they would create.
Correct.
You can't travel. You can't eat meat. You have to be in a 15-minute city. You can't have a furnace. You can't have a water heater that uses gas.
Don't forget the pizza ovens aren't supposed to be the
pizza ovens.
Right.
We have to destroy the farms because cows fart methane.
Right. So. Nitrogen is the enemy. We can't allow foreign election interference unless George Soros does it. That sort of thing.
We don't need fair elections. What do we need a fair election for? We already know who won.
Right. Exactly.
We don't need to bother. These free elections are messy, and we know who won. Why bother? Okay, so look, we don't want to live in that world. And the end of
imagine it though.
Well, it's not only being imagined; it's being proposed.
Right,
and it's being openly proposed. The World Economic Forum is telling you where they're going. Schwab is not, whatever his name is, he's not being discreet about his great reset.
Right.
Klaus Schwab. And so the globalists are on the march, and Satan's on the march. We've got destruction. We're going to have, it sure looks like end times events. And I always say, in the end, God always wins. God will win here too. I have no doubt about it. And I think we'll get through this period of time. I think enough people are beginning to see and are beginning to pray. I think revival is possible. I know the solution's given to us in the Bible. It's 2 Corinthians 7:14, where God urges us to get on our knees and ask for forgiveness for letting the world get to this point. And I believe we should do that. I am doing that. What God says is he will hear our prayer and heal our land. God's intervention is going to have to come, because this is so messed up that human beings will only from here mess it up further. In other words, the war in the Middle East will go to a regional war. The war in Ukraine, eventually Russia's going to get tired of us funding Ukraine for more weapons. They'll use weapons which Russia will say enough. And Russia's got nuclear weapons in Belarus. Russia's more threatened numerous times that they would use nuclear weapons if this war got to a certain point where Russia could no longer tolerate it. And China is going to go to make a move against Taiwan. The question is when. It's poised to do it. It's threatening to do it. It's maneuvering to do it. When China feels like it's got a green light, or like Hong Kong, no one will do anything to stop them, China will move. And this is going to be a dark period of time. To protect yourself, get out of debt if you can. Don't use your credit cards to live on if you can avoid it. And call this toll-free number, 1-800-519-6268. Get a little bit of gold, because at least it'll appreciate. And even if you can't afford thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars in gold are going to pay off. There'll still be a market for it. You can sell it. And it's going to appreciate dramatically. If it does what past economic downturns have indicated it does when crises occur of this global nature, it could double in price. It could go to $4,000 an ounce. And I believe oil could go to $200 a barrel. And food will increase in its cost too. We're going to have increasing homelessness. We're going to have increasing people living in Hoovervilles, maybe call them Bidenvilles, in their RVs, in their cars, in tents in the park, and it's going to be winter. It's going to be cold. That's climate change. It's called summer, fall, winter, spring. It's the way the Earth at a tilt goes through seasons. Its axis tilted to at an angle to its orbit. This is Dr. Jerome Corsi. Thank you for joining us. This is thetruthcentral.com. Please spread the word about this channel. And we will be back tomorrow. We broadcast every weekday on thetruthcentral.com. Thank you for joining us. God bless.